The moment I turned the watch over in my hands, something did not feel right. It was beautiful, yes, sleek, elegant, a luxury piece that gleamed under the soft light of our living room chandelier. My husband had smiled proudly as he handed it to me, saying it was a symbol of our time together. I had laughed then, touched by the gesture, unaware of how literal his words would soon become. It was only later, long after he had gone to bed, that I noticed a strange seam along the side of the watch's face. Curious, I pressed it gently, and to my astonishment, a small panel clicked open. Inside was something I never expected to find, a tiny memory card, almost invisible, hidden so discreetly it could have easily gone unnoticed. My hands trembled as I pulled it out. My heart pounded in my chest, a heavy rhythm of panic and disbelief. Why would he hide something in a gift meant to celebrate our love? What secrets did this tiny card hold? In that moment, everything I thought I knew about my marriage shifted. I stared at the watch, no longer certain if it was a symbol of love, or the beginning of a terrible truth. I met Daniel on a rainy Tuesday afternoon, the kind of day that usually slips past unnoticed. I had ducked into a small bookstore to escape the downpour, my coat soaked and my umbrella turned useless by the wind. He was standing by the window, flipping through a worn paperback with a look of quiet concentration. When I brushed past him and accidentally knocked a book off the shelf, he bent down to pick it up before I could even apologize. His smile was warm and effortless, the kind that makes you feel seen even in the middle of a crowd. We struck up a conversation about the book I had clumsily dropped, and somehow, we never really stopped talking after that. Our connection was immediate and strong. There was a sense of comfort with him that I had never experienced before, as if he understood parts of me I had not even learned to express yet. He listened with a depth that made me feel safe, and he spoke with a gentleness that wrapped around me like a blanket. Within months, we were inseparable. Friends joked that we were one of those couples who just made sense, the kind that seemed destined to find each other. We moved in together a year later. Life with Daniel was filled with small joys, morning coffee in bed, shared playlists, lazy Sundays reading on the couch. He remembered anniversaries, brought flowers home for no reason, and always made sure the car was warmed up for me on cold mornings. When he proposed, he did it on the same street where we first met, just outside that little bookstore. He had arranged for the owner to let us in after hours, and there, surrounded by the scent of old pages and rain on the windows, he knelt down and asked me to be his wife. It was perfect, every detail reflecting how well he knew me, how deeply he seemed to care. Our wedding was a quiet affair, intimate and filled with laughter. He looked at me that day as though I was the only person in the world, and I remember thinking that if I could hold on to that look forever, I would never need anything else. The life we built afterward only deepened that belief. We bought a modest house in a quiet neighborhood, filled it with our favorite books and travel souvenirs, and began weaving our daily routines into a life that felt whole and peaceful. There was never a moment when I questioned his love. He was dependable, thoughtful, and calm in a way that balanced out my more emotional nature. I would get overwhelmed, and he would be the anchor that pulled me back to steady ground. When I faced personal losses, my mother's sudden illness, my job becoming unstable, he was always there, strong and supportive. He would make dinner when I could not bring myself to cook, rub my back in silence when the tears refused to stop, and never once made me feel like I was a burden. Even our disagreements were quiet, respectful. He never raised his voice. We communicated with care, always returning to the belief that we were on the same team. I believed we were one of the lucky couples who had figured out the secret to lasting love, mutual respect, unwavering support, and a shared understanding that whatever storms life threw our way, we would face them together. We dreamed together. We talked about future vacations, places we would retire, the kind of dog we might adopt when we finally had a yard big enough. He was always planning for us, thinking ahead in ways that made me feel secure. When my friends talked about their partners forgetting birthdays or being emotionally unavailable, I would silently thank the universe for giving me Daniel. I never said it out loud, but I felt proud to have a marriage that others admired. I thought we were unshakable. There were moments so full of love that I thought my heart might burst from holding them all. He would reach for my hand during long drives, or brush my hair off my face when I fell asleep on the couch. He would leave sticky notes on the bathroom mirror with little jokes or affirmations that carried me through tough days. On our 5th anniversary, he surprised me with a weekend getaway to the lake cabin I had always dreamed of visiting. We sat on the porch wrapped in blankets, watching the stars, and I remember thinking that nothing could ever come between us. I had never known a love so peaceful, so grounding. When he gifted me the watch on our 10th anniversary, I believed it was just one more thoughtful gesture in a long line of many. It came in a dark velvet box, nestled carefully like a treasure. He had chosen a design I had once admired in passing, and it fit perfectly around my wrist. He told me it represented all the time we had spent together, and all the time we still had ahead of us. I had smiled and kissed him, my heart full, never imagining that such a beautiful symbol could carry anything but love. Looking back now, I can see how easily I trusted the life we had built, how completely I let myself believe in the image we had created. Every photo on the wall, every quiet moment shared, had seemed to reinforce the belief that we were solid, that our foundation was real. There were no loud arguments, no late nights unaccounted for, no signs that anything was amiss. If there were cracks, they were too fine for me to notice. I believed in our story with every part of me. I had handed him my heart and trusted he would protect it. That is why, when I found that hidden card inside the watch, the weight of that trust began to crush me. I thought I knew the man I had married. I thought I knew the life we had created. But in that moment, holding a secret that had no place in a gift of love, I realized that there was a version of Daniel I had never seen. And suddenly, I was no longer certain how much of our perfect marriage had ever been real. The week leading up to our 10th wedding anniversary had been unusually calm. Life had a way of speeding past us, always filled with errands, deadlines, and the quiet, persistent hum of routine. But that week, Daniel seemed to go out of his way to create a sense of peace around us. He handled most of the housework without me asking. He cooked my favorite meals, left fresh flowers on the kitchen table, and played our song in the background as we ate dinner. He was more affectionate than usual, lingering in his hugs, brushing his fingers through my hair when he thought I was not paying attention. I had assumed it was his way of marking our milestone, a quiet celebration of how far we had come. I was not expecting anything extravagant. That was never our style. We had always believed that small gestures carried more meaning than grand ones. So when he told me he had something special planned for the evening of our anniversary, I felt touched more than anything else. He would not tell me what it was, only smiled in that gentle way of his and told me to dress up, but not too formally. It made me laugh, that vague instruction. I chose a soft blue dress he had always liked, the one I had worn the night he proposed. He took me to a quiet restaurant just outside of town, one we had visited once years ago and had not returned to since. I remembered how much we had enjoyed the place, its cozy lighting and the way the waiters always seemed to know exactly when to appear and when to leave us alone. The food was still delicious, and the wine, carefully chosen by Daniel, was perfectly matched. He reached for my hand across the table, his eyes warm as he spoke about the life we had built, the years that had passed, and how grateful he was to share them with me. I felt safe in that moment, wrapped in the glow of the candlelight and his affection. It was the kind of evening that made everything else fade away. When the check was paid and we stepped outside into the cool night air, he reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small, square box wrapped in silver paper. His voice was soft as he handed it to me, telling me it was something to mark our time together. My hands trembled slightly as I unwrapped the box. Inside was a watch. Not just any watch. It was stunning. The band was made of polished rose gold, sleek and elegant, with a delicate chain-link design that shimmered under the streetlight. The face of the watch was a muted pearl, simple and timeless, framed with a subtle halo of diamonds. It was unlike anything I had ever owned, the kind of piece you admire from afar but never expect to wear. It was luxurious, but not flashy. Feminine, but strong. Everything about it felt intentional. I looked up at him, surprised and deeply moved. He knew I had always admired watches like this, had even pointed one out in a magazine years ago, but I had never thought he remembered. I whispered his name, my voice catching in my throat, and he smiled in that quiet way that always made me feel like I was home. He fastened the watch around my wrist himself, taking his time, his fingers gentle as they brushed against my skin. The metal was cool at first, but quickly warmed against me. I could not stop staring at it. The way it caught the light. The weight of it on my wrist. The symbolism of it. A decade together, marked by something that measured time. It felt poetic, like a reflection of our life, steady, beautiful, precise. I turned my hand slightly, watching the second hand tick forward, thinking about all the minutes and hours we had shared, all the moments that had led us here. I thanked him, not just with words, but with a kiss that lingered longer than usual, full of emotion I could not fully express. Back at home, I placed the watch carefully in its box, too precious to wear to bed. I wanted to look at it a little longer, to admire the fine details. The craftsmanship was extraordinary. There was a small signature etched into the clasp, something I had never seen before. I leaned closer, trying to make out the name. It was a designer I recognized, but one far beyond anything we had ever considered buying. I wondered how long he had been planning this. How many times he had gone back and forth, choosing the right piece, the right moment. The next day, I wore it proudly. My friends at work noticed it immediately, admiring its delicate design and elegance. I told them it was a gift from my husband, an anniversary present, and they smiled knowingly, some with envy, others with kind approval. One of my coworkers asked if Daniel had picked it out himself, and I nodded, feeling a flush of pride. He had always had excellent taste, but more than that, he had always known me well enough to choose something that felt deeply personal. Over the next few days, I found myself glancing at the watch more often than I needed to. It was more than a timepiece. It felt like a promise, a marker of everything we had gone through and everything that still lay ahead. Every glance reminded me of that quiet evening, his hand holding mine, the soft words we had exchanged, the warmth of his presence. I caught myself smiling for no reason, touched by the thoughtfulness of it all. I never imagined it would become something else entirely. I never suspected that beneath that flawless surface, behind the soft shimmer of diamonds and polished gold, something entirely different was waiting. A truth I was never meant to find. Something hidden in plain sight. But in those first few days, I only saw the beauty. I only felt the love. And I believed, with every beat of my heart, that the gift on my wrist was exactly what it appeared to be, a celebration of time, of us, of a marriage that felt solid and unshakable. I had no way of knowing that it held more than just sentiment. That it held a secret. One that would unravel everything. In the days that followed our anniversary, I noticed things that I tried to dismiss. At first, they were so subtle that they barely registered. I told myself I was imagining it, that I was overanalyzing because the evening had been so perfect. But once a thought like that takes hold, it begins to color everything around it. And once the cracks begin to show, it becomes impossible not to see them. Daniel started to act differently, in ways I could not easily define. He was still kind, still affectionate, but there was a tension beneath the surface that had not been there before. It was in the way he avoided eye contact when I asked simple questions, or how he would suddenly change the subject if a conversation drifted too close to certain topics. He seemed more distracted, like his thoughts were always elsewhere, like he was trying to keep up a front while managing something behind the scenes. One morning, I found him standing by the bedroom window, fully dressed even though he did not need to leave for work for another hour. His phone was in his hand, but when I entered the room, he quickly slipped it into his pocket and gave me a strained smile. I asked if everything was all right. He said yes, just checking emails, but his voice lacked its usual calmness. I tried to brush it off, telling myself he might be stressed from work. but he had never been good at hiding things from me before. This felt like a man trying to keep something hidden. Later that week, I noticed him being more protective of his phone than usual. Daniel had never been secretive about his devices. We had always respected each other's privacy, but there was no need for password protection or hiding screens. Suddenly, he was always holding it close, setting it face down on the table, taking it with him even when he went to shower. I caught him once glancing at a message, and when he saw me watching, he quickly turned the screen away and said it was just a work notification. But the way he said it, too quickly, too rehearsed, made something tighten in my chest. His routines began to shift as well. He started leaving the house earlier in the mornings, saying he had a new project to manage that required more of his time. Sometimes he would come home later, giving vague reasons about meetings running long or helping a colleague with a deadline. When I asked for details, he would offer only the broadest of answers. No names, no specifics. It was not like him. Daniel was the kind of person who enjoyed talking about his day, who would describe office politics with amused detachment and share stories about coworkers. That version of him had gone quiet. One evening, I made his favorite dinner. It had been a long week, and I wanted to do something nice for him. I set the table, lit a few candles, and waited for him to come home. But he was late. He did not call or text. An hour passed, then 2. When he finally walked in the door, he looked surprised to see everything set up. He said he had lost track of time. There was a shadow of guilt in his eyes, but he tried to mask it with a quick kiss and an apology. We sat down to eat, and he barely touched his food. I asked again about his work, trying to understand what was pulling him away. He said things had been chaotic, that his team was under pressure to deliver on a tight deadline. He promised it would ease up soon. I nodded, pretending to believe him, but there was something hollow in his words. I had never known Daniel to lie to me, and that was what made it so difficult. I wanted to believe he was just overwhelmed. I wanted to believe he was still the man who had stood across from me on our anniversary night, fastening a watch around my wrist with steady hands and loving eyes. The watch itself had become a strange symbol in all of this. I wore it every day, and yet there were moments when I looked at it and felt unease, as if the weight of it had shifted. I could not explain it, but I started to feel like the gift had been meant to distract me from something else. Like it had been too perfect, too well-timed. I remembered how he had not let me look at it too long at the restaurant, how he had quickly fastened it on my wrist and smiled as if trying to move the moment along. At the time, I had thought it was simply part of the romance. Now, I was not so sure. I began to watch him more closely, trying to catch the little things he did not say. When he hugged me, did he feel distant? When he laughed, was it genuine or forced? When he said he loved me, was he trying to convince me, or himself? These thoughts made me feel like I was losing my grip, like I was spiraling into paranoia. But there was a part of me, deep down, that whispered I was not wrong. That something was happening beneath the surface, just out of sight. One night, I woke up and found him missing from our bed. I walked through the house and found him sitting in the living room in the dark, staring at nothing. He jumped when I turned on the light. I asked if he was all right, and he said he just could not sleep. I asked if he wanted to talk, but he shook his head. There was something haunted in his expression, something that made my skin prickle. I sat beside him in silence, hoping he would open up. He did not. From that point on, my unease turned into quiet suspicion. I did not have proof of anything. I did not have facts, only feelings. But feelings have their own kind of truth. They rise up when the world around you stops making sense, when the person you trust most begins to shift in ways you cannot explain. And Daniel was shifting. He was still here, still beside me, but there were moments when it felt like he had already gone somewhere else. I just did not know where or why or with whom. I told myself that I was imagining things, that all couples go through strange patches, that stress could make anyone behave differently. But in my heart, I knew better. Something had changed. Something was hidden, and I could feel the shadow of it every time he looked away. It happened on a quiet Sunday afternoon, the kind where the world feels still and uneventful. Daniel had gone out to run errands, something about picking up supplies for a project he was doing in the garage. I had stayed behind, planning to catch up on laundry and maybe read for a bit. I was not thinking about the watch at all. It was simply there on my wrist, part of my daily routine now. But as I was folding clothes, I noticed the clasp felt a little looser than usual. I tried to tighten it, thinking maybe I had not secured it properly earlier, and that was when I felt it. A strange little shift in the weight. Not just loose, off. Curiosity tugged at me. I took the watch off and held it in my hands. It still looked perfect on the outside, polished and elegant, the kind of gift that speaks of care and affection. But something inside it moved slightly when I tilted it. I brought it closer to my ear and gently shook it. There was a faint rattle, like something small had come loose. My first thought was that it might be broken. But then I looked more closely, really examined the back of the watch. There was a tiny indentation near the clasp, almost invisible unless you knew to look for it. I pressed my nail against it. Nothing happened at first, but then I tried using a paperclip, easing it into the space like I had once seen Daniel do when resetting a device. To my surprise, a small section of the back popped open with a soft click. My heart skipped a beat. I stared at the hollowed-out compartment in disbelief. This was not a storage feature. This was hidden. Deliberately hidden. Inside the compartment was a tiny plastic sleeve, and inside that, something even more unexpected. A micro SD card. I just stared at it for a long moment, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. There was no note, no explanation. Just that tiny piece of tech tucked neatly into the secret compartment of a gift meant to celebrate our love. My hands were shaking as I removed it. I did not know what to think. My mind raced through possibilities, each more confusing than the last. Why would Daniel hide something in my anniversary gift? Why go to such lengths to conceal it? I felt a cold unease begin to creep through me, like the room had suddenly gotten darker even though the sun was still streaming in through the windows. I looked around, half expecting someone to burst in and explain this all away as a joke, a mistake, a misunderstanding. But I was alone. Alone with a watch that was not just a watch, and a marriage that suddenly felt less stable than I had believed. I could not just leave the card sitting there. I needed to know what it held. My hands moved almost without thought, grabbing my laptop, inserting the card into the adapter we kept for photos. My heart pounded so loudly I could hear it in my ears. The screen flickered as the computer recognized the new input. A folder opened automatically. There were files. Several of them. The first thing I noticed was that the files were audio. Voice recordings. I hesitated, my finger hovering above the play button. I did not know what I was expecting. Maybe Daniel had recorded a loving message and hidden it for me to find someday. A romantic surprise delayed by design. But that hope, faint as it was, vanished the moment I pressed play. The voice that filled the room was Daniel's. But it was not the Daniel I knew. It was clipped, formal, almost cautious. He was speaking to someone I could not hear, giving updates, talking about movements, locations, and times. The words were vague, but the tone was unmistakably serious. It was the voice of someone who was involved in something secretive, something calculated. It did not sound like a man leaving messages for his wife. It sounded like surveillance, documentation. There were several recordings. I clicked through them, stunned into silence. One file was of him describing what I had worn that day, how I had spent my afternoon, what I had said on the phone to my sister. Every detail was accurate. My blood ran cold. He had been watching me, recording me, without my knowledge, without my consent. One file in particular made my stomach turn. It was Daniel speaking about a meeting, confirming that he had planted the device and that she had no idea. That phrase, she had no idea, echoed in my mind like a hammer blow. I sat back in my chair, hands trembling, unable to move. What was this? Why would he record me? Why hide it inside the very gift meant to celebrate our relationship? Questions piled on top of one another, crashing down like a wave I could not stop. My heart ached, not just from the betrayal but from the violation. He had invaded the space between us, the trust we had built, and had done it so carefully, so silently, that I had not even noticed. I opened the remaining files, hoping for context, for an explanation. But they only made things worse. Some were logs, daily entries of what I had said or done, who I had spoken to. Others were private recordings of our conversations, things I had shared in confidence. And then I found one that was different. It was not Daniel speaking. It was another man, giving instructions. His voice was low and firm, and he mentioned my name more than once. He spoke about timelines and objectives, about keeping the operation quiet. I could not make sense of it. What operation? What objective? I felt like I had stumbled into a world I was never meant to see. Like I had become a character in someone else's narrative, and my life, the life I thought was real, was something entirely different behind the scenes. I removed the card, hands still shaking, and stared at it in silence. That tiny piece of plastic had shattered everything. The sound of Daniel's car pulling into the driveway jolted me back to reality. I quickly closed the laptop and put the card back into its compartment, snapping the cover shut. My breathing was shallow. My mind was racing. I did not know what to do. I did not know if I should confront him right away or wait. I only knew one thing for certain. Nothing about my life or my marriage would ever feel safe again. I sat on the edge of the bed, the room spinning around me in slow, disorienting circles. My palms were still damp from handling the tiny memory card, and my heart refused to settle, pounding with a relentless rhythm that echoed inside my chest. The shock of what I had just discovered felt unreal, as though I had been dropped into a nightmare I could not wake from. I stared at the watch resting on the dresser, its polished surface reflecting the soft light of the evening sun, looking so innocent, so deceptively perfect. That was the worst part. How ordinary it looked. How completely it had fooled me. My mind tried to push the images and sounds from the recordings away, but they clung stubbornly, refusing to be forgotten. Daniel's voice, calm and methodical, recounting my daily activities with clinical precision. The stranger's voice, giving orders that made no sense to me but clearly involved me in ways I could not understand. I kept telling myself there had to be a mistake. There had to be some logical explanation, some absurd coincidence that would unravel this nightmare and return me to the safe, familiar life I thought I had. For a moment, I considered that I might have misunderstood everything. Maybe the files were not what they seemed. Maybe Daniel had recorded something for work, or had been preparing some elaborate surprise that had gone terribly wrong. Maybe he had purchased a refurbished watch and had no idea what was hidden inside. The ideas came quickly, each more desperate than the last, each one trying to shield me from the pain of what I had seen and heard. But the recordings were clear. They were deliberate. The way he had spoken, the words he used, the tone of his voice, there was no mistaking it. And yet, I could not stop myself from searching for another truth, something that would make the betrayal vanish. How could the man I had loved, the man I had trusted with my whole heart, do something so invasive, so calculated? The man who had kissed my forehead every night, who had held my hand during hard times, who had whispered that I was his whole world. How could he be the same man whose voice had chronicled my life like I was a subject under observation? My thoughts became tangled in memories, each one clashing against the next. I remembered the way he had looked at me when he gave me the watch, his eyes warm, his smile gentle. I remembered the dinners we had shared, the laughter that came easily, the comfort of our quiet routines. I remembered the moments when I had leaned on him for strength, and he had been there without hesitation. Was all of it real? Or had it all been a performance, a carefully crafted illusion to keep me from seeing what was truly going on? Doubt began to settle deep within me, an unwelcome guest refusing to leave. I questioned everything. Had I missed signs? Had there been red flags I had chosen to ignore? I replayed moments in my head, conversations, odd glances, the way he sometimes paused before answering questions. I wondered if his late nights had truly been work-related, or if they had been something else entirely. My brain raced to fill in the blanks, but each answer only brought more questions. The urge to confront him was strong, but so was the fear. What if I was wrong? What if I accused him and destroyed something that had not truly been broken? What if I had misinterpreted everything and made a fool of myself? But the fear that I was right was stronger still. If what I had discovered was the truth, then my entire life had been built on a lie. And I was not ready to face that possibility. I wandered through the house in a daze, touching familiar objects like they might anchor me to something real. The framed photos on the wall, our wedding picture in the hallway, the throw blanket we had picked out together. Each one felt like a relic of a life that might never have truly existed. I kept waiting for the wave of anger to hit me, but it did not come. Not yet. Only numbness. Only disbelief. I thought back to the early days of our relationship, when everything felt new and certain. I had believed in us completely. I had never doubted his love, never questioned his loyalty. We had shared secrets, dreams, even our fears. We had built a life together. I had trusted him with every piece of myself. And now, I found myself questioning whether he had ever truly shared anything real with me at all. That night, I could not sleep. I lay in bed, my body motionless, my mind relentlessly awake. Daniel lay beside me, breathing deeply, completely unaware that the foundation of our marriage had cracked wide open. I stared at the ceiling, feeling the weight of silence press against my chest. I wanted to shake him awake, demand answers, demand the truth. But I could not. I was not ready. I needed time. I needed space to sort through the mess of my thoughts before I faced whatever truth he might give me. Part of me wanted to believe that love could not be this cruel, that the man I had loved so deeply could not have betrayed me in this way. But the other part, the part that had heard his voice describing my every move like I was a stranger, knew that denial could only shield me for so long. Eventually, I would have to confront the reality of what I had discovered. But in that moment, I clung to the hope that there might still be some explanation, some version of the truth that would not destroy everything. I drifted in and out of a restless sleep, haunted by images I could not control. I dreamed of the watch ticking louder and louder, echoing through empty rooms. I dreamed of Daniel standing just out of reach, his face hidden in shadows. And when I woke, I felt no peace, only the growing weight of a question I did not yet have the courage to ask. What had my husband really been hiding from me all this time? And who had I truly been married to? It took me 3 days to gather the strength to confront him. 3 days of pretending everything was fine, smiling through meals, nodding along to conversations I barely heard, and forcing myself to sleep beside a man whose every breath felt like a betrayal. I rehearsed the confrontation in my mind over and over again, trying to predict how he would react, trying to imagine every possible scenario so I would not be blindsided again. But no matter how many versions of the conversation I played out in my head, I knew there was no way to prepare for the truth, or for more lies. It was a Sunday afternoon. The air was thick with quiet tension as sunlight streamed through the kitchen windows. He sat at the table, scrolling through his phone while sipping coffee. I stood by the sink, my fingers gripping the edge of the counter, my body trembling despite the warmth of the room. I knew if I did not speak in that moment, I might never find the courage again. So I turned to him and said his name, steady and low. He looked up with a casual smile that faded quickly when he saw my expression. I walked to the table and placed the watch in front of him. His eyes dropped to it, and then slowly returned to mine. For a long second, neither of us spoke. Then I asked the question I had been dreading. I asked him what was really inside the watch. I asked him what he had been recording and why. His face remained unreadable for a moment. Then he blinked, and something flickered in his eyes. Surprise, maybe, or calculation. He picked up the watch and turned it in his hands slowly, like he was buying time. Then he laughed softly, a hollow sound that scraped at my nerves. He said I was imagining things. He said there was nothing in the watch but gears and batteries. I did not respond. I just stared at him until the silence became unbearable. When I told him I had found the hidden compartment, when I told him I had seen the memory card and listened to the files, his entire demeanor shifted. His body stiffened, and the color drained from his face. Still, he tried to recover, to twist the truth into something less damning. He claimed it was a mistake, that he had no idea how those recordings ended up there. He said maybe it had been tampered with during shipping. Maybe someone else had planted it. Maybe it had belonged to someone before him. Every word he said was carefully chosen, every sentence crafted to confuse, to deflect, to redirect. I sat across from him, listening, but not hearing. My mind was caught between heartbreak and fury, disbelief and clarity. I asked him why his voice was on the recordings. He said it was not him. I asked him why the files mentioned things only he could have known. He said I was jumping to conclusions. I told him there was no way anyone else could have recorded what I heard. He looked me straight in the eyes and said I must have misunderstood what I was hearing. His lies were not frantic. They were calm, measured, almost rehearsed. That was what terrified me most, how easily he slipped into them, how naturally he wore that mask of innocence. It was as if he had done this before, as if gaslighting me was just another part of his routine. The more I pushed, the more he pulled away, retreating into a version of the truth that served only him. When I told him I did not believe him, he looked genuinely hurt. He said he could not believe I was accusing him of something so outrageous after everything we had been through. I wanted to scream. I wanted to throw the watch across the room, to tear down every illusion we had built together. But instead, I sat there, my hands folded tightly in my lap, my voice quiet but firm. I told him that trust was not something you could rebuild with lies. I told him that whatever game he had been playing, it had cost us everything. And still, he refused to admit anything. He clung to the narrative that I was wrong, that I was confused, that I was overreacting. The worst part was how convincing he could be. There was a moment, a flicker of doubt, when I wondered if maybe, just maybe, I had misunderstood something. Maybe I had let my imagination get the best of me. Maybe the recordings were part of something else entirely. But then I remembered the sound of his voice saying things no one else could have known. I remembered the way he had described where I went, what I did, what I said. It had been him. There was no room left for doubt. When I told him I wanted space, he became angry. He slammed his hand on the table and demanded to know why I was doing this to him. He accused me of ruining our marriage, of tearing us apart over something that did not even make sense. He said I had always been too suspicious, too paranoid, too sensitive. And in that moment, I saw it clearly. Every word he spoke was not about love or remorse. It was about control. It was about keeping me in the dark, about making me question myself so I would not question him. My emotions swirled inside me like a storm. Grief, rage, confusion, betrayal. I had wanted him to confess, to come clean, to tell me the truth so we could face it together, even if it meant the end. But he would not. He chose denial. He chose manipulation. And I realized then that I had never truly known the man I had married. The man who had once looked at me like I was his entire world had become a stranger, hiding behind lies, using love as a weapon to keep me bound. When the conversation ended, there was no resolution, no apology, no truth, just silence and distance. I walked away with my heart in pieces, my trust shattered, and the painful understanding that the life I had believed in was gone. And he sat there, still trying to rewrite the story, still trying to hold on to the version of himself that had never truly existed. I did not sleep that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw his face. I heard his voice telling me I was wrong. I felt the weight of that watch in my palm, like a silent witness to everything that had unraveled. I stared at the ceiling in the dark and listened to his footsteps in the hallway, listened to the water running in the bathroom, listened to the quiet hush of the house that no longer felt like a home. Something inside me had shifted. I no longer wanted just answers. I needed them. By morning, I knew I could not rely on him to tell me the truth. If I wanted to know what he had been hiding, I would have to find it myself. I began with the watch. I retrieved the tiny memory card I had hidden and slipped it into my laptop. I had already listened to a few recordings, but now I opened every folder, every file, searching for patterns, for connections, for names or places that might give me a clue. Some of the recordings were mundane, just quiet background noise, or short clips with no clear context. But others were sharp and chilling, filled with whispers, conversations, and mentions of dates and times I remembered living through, now tinted with a sinister edge. One particular file caught my attention. It was labeled only with numbers. I clicked on it and listened. His voice came through clearly. He was speaking to someone else, not me, not anyone I recognized. He described where I had gone that afternoon. He mentioned the store I had visited, the dress I had tried on, the phone call I had made to my sister. Every detail was exact, down to the time I had returned home. He laughed as he spoke, casually, like it was all part of a game. The other voice on the recording was low, unfamiliar, asking questions, prompting him. And then I heard it. He called me by a nickname I had never heard before, like I was a character, not a person. I sat frozen, my hands trembling. He had been tracking me, watching me, recording details of my life and sharing them with someone else. Why? For what purpose? Was it some twisted project? A betrayal I could not yet understand? I did not have the answers, but I knew I needed help. I reached out to someone I trusted, my friend Carla. She was brilliant with technology, far more skilled than I was, and I knew I could count on her discretion. When I called and told her I needed help looking into something sensitive, she did not ask too many questions. She just told me to bring everything I had. At her apartment, I handed over the memory card and explained what little I had pieced together. She listened carefully, her eyes narrowing with concern as she began running recovery software on the files. She pulled out metadata, scanned hidden folders, traced audio patterns. As she worked, I saw her expression darken. She told me that these files were not just from the watch. They had been synced from another device. That meant he had been backing them up, probably to a cloud account or another hidden location. She asked for his phone. I told her I could not get it without him noticing, but I did have access to the home Wi-Fi router. That was enough for her to dig deeper. She connected to it and began tracing devices that had been on the network. It took time, but eventually she found what we were looking for, a hidden laptop, previously connected, under a generic name. It had accessed several cloud storage platforms, one of which was still partially active. She found cached credentials. What she pulled up next made my skin crawl. Photos of me. Dozens of them, taken from angles I could not explain. Some from inside the house, others clearly from places I had visited alone. Screenshots of my messages. Snippets of my private phone calls, transcribed into text. There were even notes about my behavior, my routines, my words. It was as if someone had been building a dossier about me, piece by piece, day by day. There were folders labeled with codes, initials, and numbers. Carla and I opened one marked with a date from the year before. Inside were messages, emails between my husband and someone else. They discussed me like I was a subject. Not a wife, not a partner, but an assignment. A role. A situation to be monitored. My stomach turned as I read the words. One of the messages said, "She has no idea. She still thinks I am exactly who I told her I was." Another read, "The anniversary is coming. I will use the gift as planned." The gift. The watch. That meant the plan had been in place for months, if not longer. This had not been some sudden lapse in judgment. It was premeditated, structured, executed with precision. I asked Carla if she could find out who the other person was in those emails. She dug deeper, tracing IPs, running name searches through databases. It led us to a burner email account, but one connected briefly to an address registered under a company I had never heard of. We looked into the company. On the surface, it was a small consulting firm, but further research showed it had ties to surveillance services, cybersecurity consulting, and even private investigations. I felt like the floor was falling out from under me. What was he involved in? Was this some kind of undercover operation? Or something even darker? Carla warned me to be careful. She said whoever was behind this had covered their tracks well. But not perfectly. With enough digging, we might be able to uncover the truth. I took screenshots. I backed up everything we found. I created a folder that I encrypted and emailed to myself, just in case something happened to my laptop. That night, I returned home feeling like a stranger in my own life. I watched him move through the house, acting like nothing had changed, like I was still his loving, oblivious wife. But I was no longer in the dark. I was watching him now. I was listening. Every word he said, every glance, every shift in tone. I analyzed it all. He had played a game with my life. Now I was ready to play my part, not as his pawn, but as someone prepared to uncover every secret he thought I would never find. There is a strange kind of silence that follows a major discovery, the kind that is not peaceful, but deafening. In the quiet moments after finding what I had found, my mind began to rewind everything I thought I knew. Each memory became a question mark. Every smile, every touch, every shared glance became something to inspect, to doubt. I started seeing the past not through the lens of love, but through the lens of suspicion. And once I began, I could not stop. I remembered the time he went on a business trip to Chicago. He said it was for a 3-day conference, something about data management, and I had not questioned it. He brought back souvenirs, small things he knew I would like, coffee beans from a local shop, a handmade journal, a scarf in my favorite color. I had smiled and kissed him and told him how thoughtful he was. But now I remembered that when I tried to call him on the second day of his trip, his phone went straight to voicemail for hours. When he finally returned my call, he said the hotel's cell reception was terrible and that he had just come out of a long seminar. At the time, it made sense. Now, it did not. There were other moments, scattered across the years. Once, I had walked into the living room late at night and found him quickly closing his laptop. He had laughed and said he was looking up gift ideas for my birthday. I had believed him. Why would I not? Now I saw the flicker of guilt in his smile that night, the quick way he changed the subject. That same night, I had noticed his hands shaking slightly. I thought he was tired. Maybe he was, but not in the way I had imagined. I remembered how he started locking his phone a few years ago. He said it was for work security. I had never been the kind of wife who demanded access or questioned his privacy. But I remembered how once, his phone lit up during dinner. I caught a glimpse of a name I did not recognize. He told me it was a client and put the phone face down without checking the message. Now I wished I had asked more questions. Now I wondered how many lies had been slipped between laughter and wine. One particular memory struck me like lightning. We had gone to a wedding together, one of his old college friends. I barely knew anyone there, but he had been eager to attend. At one point during the reception, I saw him stepping outside to take a call. When I asked him about it later, he brushed it off, said it was a work emergency, nothing important. But that night, he had seemed tense, distant, and he barely spoke during the drive home. I had blamed it on exhaustion. Now, I remembered how his suit pocket had buzzed a second time, and he ignored it with a flicker of irritation that did not match the occasion. I never asked about it again. I wish I had. There was also the time I found a receipt in his jacket pocket for a dinner at a restaurant I had never been to. The date on the receipt was a night he told me he was working late. I had called him that evening and he told me he was still at the office. He said he would be home late, and I had gone to bed early. When I asked him about the receipt days later, he said it must have been from lunch with a client. I remember the feeling of confusion, the flicker of doubt, but I pushed it away. I chose to trust him. Now, I saw that moment for what it was. A missed signal, a fork in the road I had taken blindly. Even the little things now felt like echoes from a broken mirror. There were nights when he came home smelling faintly of a perfume I did not wear. He said he had hugged a colleague goodbye or brushed against someone on the subway. There were days he was irritable for no reason, snapping at questions, withdrawing into his own head. He would apologize quickly, kiss my forehead, and say work was stressful. I had been patient, supportive, understanding. Now I saw how those moments had been signs, not flukes. And there were lies, small ones that felt harmless until I saw them stacked together. He once told me he had gone to visit his brother, but later mentioned something about seeing a movie alone. I had not connected the contradiction. I had dismissed it as forgetfulness. Now I realized it was a pattern. Another time, he claimed his phone had died and that was why he had not replied for several hours. But the message he finally sent had a timestamp that did not match his story. I had laughed it off. I had told myself it did not matter. It was painful to re-examine my life like this, to look back on all the days I had trusted him and realize how many of them were built on lies. The truth was like a slow poison, seeping into every memory, corroding the happiness I once believed was real. I remembered our vacation in the mountains, how he had disappeared for a few hours one afternoon, saying he went to get supplies. He returned with firewood and snacks, and I had not questioned anything. But now I remembered that his phone had been turned off during that time. And I remembered how he had seemed distracted that night, staring into the fire with a distant expression. The puzzle pieces began to fit. The mysterious phone calls, the business trips, the strange passwords on his devices, the way he sometimes seemed too perfect, like he was acting a role rather than living a life. It all formed a picture I had never seen before, one that made my stomach turn. I wondered how long it had been going on. I wondered who else knew. I wondered if I had ever truly known him at all. It hurt to admit how blind I had been, how deeply I had believed in us. I had loved him with an open heart, never suspecting the shadows hiding behind his smiles. And yet, I could not let myself drown in regret. Each flashback, each remembered lie, gave me strength. I was not foolish. I had been deceived by someone I trusted completely. There was a difference. And now, with each memory reframed, I was closer to understanding the truth I had been denied for far too long. It was late at night when the final truth unraveled before me, like the last thread holding together a tapestry of lies. After weeks of digging, questioning, and fighting my own disbelief, I found what I had not wanted to believe. The truth had always been there, hiding just beneath the surface of a perfectly crafted life. The watch had been the key, not just a symbol of love, but a device meant to control, monitor, and deceive. When I finally understood what he had hidden, my knees felt weak, my hands cold, my breath shallow. My husband, the man I had trusted with everything, had not been living a double life in the emotional sense alone. He had orchestrated an entire second existence, complete with another identity, a different life, and a separate family. I had gone back into the files I recovered from the device in the watch, determined to decode the last few pieces. It was not only voice recordings or occasional messages that were stored in that hidden compartment. There were entire folders, encrypted and carefully labeled. With the help of someone who knew how to break past the digital walls, I unearthed hundreds of documents. Some were financial statements tied to a name I had never heard before, but the birth date matched his. Others were photographs, grainy, hurried images of a woman and 2 children in what looked like a suburban neighborhood. In one image, he was sitting at a park bench, holding a small boy in his lap while the woman stood beside them smiling. The timestamp was from just 3 months ago. That very weekend, he had told me he was at a conference out of town. The names in the files matched those I had seen in passing, in slips of conversation I had ignored. The woman's name was Claire. The children's names were Ethan and Lily. My heart broke again with every new piece of evidence. There were emails, too, loving words written to her, not to me. Promises, plans, affectionate messages sent while he was sitting across from me on our couch, pretending to be absorbed in a work email. The language in his messages to Claire mirrored the way he used to speak to me when we first fell in love. He told her she was his anchor. He said he would make everything right soon, that she would never have to be the other woman again. The most disturbing realization came when I found a file labeled surveillance. I opened it expecting perhaps data or work notes, but what I saw chilled me. There were photos of me, taken without my knowledge, in our home, at my workplace, while I was out shopping. There were audio files as well, pulled from the watch itself. Every time I had worn it, it had been listening. Conversations I had with my sister, phone calls to my best friend, even intimate moments of vulnerability, all recorded. The watch was never a gift. It was a tool. I remembered how he insisted I wear it, how he made jokes about it being a symbol of time and love. The truth was, it was his way of watching me, of listening to me, of keeping tabs on what I knew and how close I might come to the truth. I could no longer deny the magnitude of the betrayal. This was not a man who had simply strayed. This was a man who had built an entire architecture of lies. His secret family lived just one town over. He saw them regularly. He paid for their house, their school, their lives, while maintaining our life as if everything was untouched. The money I thought we were saving for our future had been funneled into a separate account that he used to support them. The time I thought he spent working late had often been time he spent tucking another child into bed. I had questions that no file could answer. How did it begin? When had he started living this other life? Did he ever intend to tell me? Did he ever love me at all, or was I just a convenient cover? But those questions had no comfort in them. The answers, if they existed, would not bring peace. They would only wound me further. When I confronted him again, with everything laid out, he broke. There was no more room for lies. He told me that it started as a mistake, an affair that turned into a child, then another. He said he could not bring himself to leave me, but he could not abandon them either. So he chose to live both lives, pretending he could manage the deception forever. The watch had been his way of keeping control, of making sure I never suspected too much. He said it was to protect himself, but also to protect me from the pain of finding out. I stared at him in disbelief, not just for what he had done, but for how he still believed he had done it all with good intentions. Protect me? How could surveillance, deception, and betrayal be considered protection? He had stripped away my dignity, my privacy, and my reality, all in the name of his convenience. What the watch represented was not just technological violation. It was the symbol of how little he truly valued my trust. It was a reminder that the person closest to me was capable of the coldest manipulations. Every time I had looked at it with pride, worn it thinking it was a romantic gesture, I had unknowingly carried my own betrayal on my wrist. Now, as I sit with a full knowledge of what he was hiding, I realize that the truth does not set you free in the way people often say. It shatters you first. It tears down everything you thought was solid, and leaves you exposed and bleeding. But from those ruins, something else begins to form. Not freedom, not immediately, but clarity. And in that clarity, there is the first flicker of strength. I may have been deceived, but I am no longer in the dark. And I will never again ignore the quiet signs, the strange instincts, or the gut feelings that whisper that something is wrong. Because now I know what it means to be watched, to be lied to, and to discover that the love you trusted was hiding something far more dangerous than silence. The days after the truth settled into my bones were unlike anything I had ever known. It was not only pain, not only betrayal, not even rage. It was a complete and total emotional collapse, like the foundation of my soul had been split open, and I was tumbling endlessly through the void. I stopped eating. I could not sleep. My chest felt heavy all the time, as if every breath was a burden I was no longer sure I could carry. I would lie in bed at night, staring at the ceiling in the dark, replaying every moment, every kiss, every I love you that had passed between us. Each memory had become a weapon, and I could not stop them from cutting into me. I isolated myself without even meaning to. People would call, but I would let the phone ring. Messages would go unread, unopened. My friends would knock, and I would pretend not to be home. I did not want to answer questions I did not know how to ask myself. I did not want comfort because comfort felt like a lie now. I could not even look at myself in the mirror without wondering how I had been so blind. How had I allowed myself to love someone who was capable of something so vile? How had I given everything to a man who had been building a life behind my back, under my nose, with his other family? Sleep became something I feared. Every time I would drift off, I would be jolted awake by nightmares. Sometimes I would see his face in my dreams, smiling the way he used to smile at me, but in the dream, it would twist into something cruel, mocking. Other times, I would see the other woman, the other children, calling out to him while I stood frozen, invisible, unwanted. I would wake up in a cold sweat, gasping for air, clutching the sheets like they were the only thing anchoring me to reality. I began to question everything. I no longer trusted my own thoughts. I would go over conversations we had shared, arguments we had resolved, holidays we had celebrated. Was he lying then? Did he send them gifts from the same trip he took me on? Was he with her on the days he claimed to be too busy to come home early? I could not distinguish truth from illusion anymore. I had lived in a carefully constructed fantasy, and now I was drowning in the rubble of my own naivety. I started to see shadows where there were none. Every time my phone buzzed, my heart would race. I kept checking my apartment for cameras, bugs, hidden devices. I tore apart drawers and cabinets, searching for anything he might have planted to keep watching me. Even though I had taken off the watch long ago, I could still feel its weight on my wrist, a phantom reminder of how easily I had been fooled. One evening, I found myself sitting on the kitchen floor, long after the sun had set, surrounded by broken plates. I did not even remember how I had knocked them off the counter. My hands were trembling, and my face was wet with tears I had not realized were falling. I stayed there for hours, unable to move, unable to care. I thought about how easy it would be to disappear. I thought about how tempting it would be to let everything go. The despair was not loud or violent. It was quiet and slow and crushing. It whispered that I was unworthy of love, that I had been made a fool, that I would never trust anyone again. And worse, that I should not. The hardest part was not that he had another family. The hardest part was that I still missed him. I missed the man I believed he was. I missed the way he would hold my hand during movies, the way he would surprise me with coffee on rough mornings, the way he would laugh when I told a joke only he found funny. That version of him was gone. Maybe he had never existed at all. But my heart had not caught up to the truth yet. It was still aching for the illusion, for the comfort of a love that had always been a lie. I began avoiding my reflection. Every time I looked into my eyes, I saw someone I no longer recognized. I saw a woman who had been too trusting, too hopeful, too desperate to believe in the good of someone who had never deserved it. I no longer felt beautiful. I no longer felt strong. I felt like a shell, fragile and splintered and hollow. There were moments when the silence in my apartment became unbearable. I would sit in the living room and stare at the wall, sometimes for hours, unable to move or speak. The television remained off. Music felt intrusive. Even the sound of traffic outside made me anxious. I had no appetite. I lost weight rapidly. My clothes hung loose, and my skin lost its glow. My body mirrored what was happening inside me. I was fading. One night, I opened the drawer where I had hidden the watch. I took it out and held it in my hands. It still looked beautiful on the outside. It still shimmered beneath the light. But I knew now that it was hollow, deceptive, dangerous. Just like him. I stared at it for a long time, my fingers trembling as I pressed the hidden latch that revealed the compartment. It was empty now, but the damage it had done could not be erased. I wanted to smash it, to destroy it, but I could not. It was proof, a relic of the truth, and somehow I was not ready to let it go. I broke down completely that night. I sobbed until I could not breathe. My whole body ached from the force of it. I curled up on the floor, clutching the watch to my chest like it was both my enemy and my only witness. I cried for the love I had lost, for the years that would never come back, for the person I used to be before I knew betrayal in such a raw and intimate way. It was the lowest point I had ever reached. A place where I felt no hope, no light, no future. Just endless pain and questions that would never be answered. I had given everything to him. And now I was left with nothing but a broken heart, a shattered sense of self, and the haunting silence of a home that no longer felt like mine. That moment on the floor became the turning point, though I did not know it then. At the time, it felt like the end. But sometimes, something has to break completely before you can begin to rebuild it. And in that complete emotional collapse, I finally faced the truth not just about him, but about myself. I had survived. And maybe, just maybe, surviving meant there was still something left to fight for. The morning after I broke down completely on the kitchen floor, I sat alone at the edge of my bed, feeling like I was made of glass. My body was sore, my eyes were swollen from crying, and my soul felt like it had been turned inside out. I had never felt more fragile, more empty, more unsure of myself. I looked around the room, at the unwashed clothes piled in the corner, the untouched meals on my nightstand, the silence that had taken root in the corners of my apartment. Something needed to change. I could not keep drowning in my own pain. I had tried to carry this burden alone, and it had nearly destroyed me. With trembling fingers, I picked up my phone. I stared at the screen for a long time, scrolling through names, hesitating with each one. I had shut everyone out for weeks. Would they even want to hear from me now? Would they believe me if I told them everything? Or would they say what a few of his friends had already implied, that I was exaggerating, that I must have misunderstood, that he was a good man and would never do something like that? I finally tapped the name of my oldest friend, Lena. She had been my closest confidant through so many phases of life, and if there was anyone who might still be there for me, it was her. My voice cracked when I spoke. I barely managed to say her name before the tears started again. But she did not hang up. She did not rush me. She waited, gently, and then asked if she could come over. I said yes, and for the first time in weeks, I felt a flicker of warmth. When Lena arrived, she did not bombard me with questions. She wrapped her arms around me, held me tightly, and let me cry again. When I finally began to speak, the words came out in fragments. I told her about the watch, about the secret compartment, about what I had found, about the second family, about the lies, about the confrontation. I spoke slowly, afraid of how it would sound out loud, afraid she might look at me differently. But she did not. Her eyes filled with tears as she listened. She reached for my hand and squeezed it. She believed me. I could see it in her face. And in that moment, something inside me began to mend. Not completely, not all at once, but a small crack in the darkness began to let in light. Encouraged by that moment of support, I decided to reach out to my sister, Mira. Our relationship had always been complicated, filled with unspoken resentments and years of distance, but she was still family. When I told her everything, she reacted with disbelief at first. She asked if I was sure, if maybe I had misunderstood what I had found. I tried to stay calm, but I felt the old sting of doubt creeping back in. It was hard enough to trust myself after everything I had gone through. Hearing hesitation in her voice made me want to retreat again. But I did not. I showed her the evidence. I played the recordings. I shared the messages I had copied before destroying the files. When she saw it all laid out clearly, her expression changed. She looked horrified, then angry on my behalf. She apologized for doubting me, and I could tell she meant it. She offered to come stay with me for a few days. I accepted. Having both Lena and Mira with me over those next few days was like being surrounded by warmth after standing in a storm for too long. They helped me clean the apartment. They made sure I ate. They reminded me that I was not alone, that I still had people who loved me. It did not erase the pain, but it helped me breathe again. It helped me stand. Mira gently suggested that I speak to a therapist. At first, I resisted. I told her I was not ready, that I did not want to explain everything all over again to a stranger, that I did not want to cry in front of someone who was being paid to listen. But later that night, as I stared at the ceiling in silence, I realized I was afraid not of therapy, but of confronting the depth of my own pain. I needed to make sense of everything I had endured. I needed help. I found a therapist online and booked an appointment. Walking into her office felt like walking into the unknown. I was shaking, but she was kind. Her voice was steady and warm. She listened without judgment. And slowly, I began to speak. The words came in pieces, just like with Lena. But they came. She helped me untangle the knot in my chest, the confusion in my mind. She helped me understand that what I was feeling was not madness. It was grief. Grief for a life I thought I had. Grief for the trust that had been shattered. Grief for the woman I used to be. She gave me tools to manage the anxiety. She helped me begin to rebuild my confidence. She did not promise healing would be easy. She did not tell me to move on quickly. She told me that healing would be messy, non-linear, and painful, but that it was possible. That was the moment the shift began. I stopped waiting for someone to rescue me. I stopped hoping he would come back and explain everything. I stopped believing that I needed closure from the man who had broken me. I began to reclaim my power. One small step at a time. I wrote everything down. Every lie. Every moment of doubt. Every sign I had missed. I created a file for myself, not to hold on to the pain, but to remind myself of the truth. So that when I faltered, when I questioned my sanity again, I would have proof that I had not imagined it all. That I had survived something real and terrible and unfair. I also joined an online support group for women who had been betrayed in similar ways. At first, I was just a silent observer. I read their stories. I cried with them, quietly, from behind my screen. Over time, I began to share my own story. The words I received in response were filled with compassion, with recognition, with strength. They lifted me in ways I had not expected. They reminded me that my pain did not define me. That I was not alone. The most powerful moment came one morning when I looked in the mirror and did not look away. I saw my swollen eyes, the faint lines of grief, the fatigue that still clung to my features. But I also saw strength. I saw a woman who had been broken but had not stayed broken. I saw someone who had faced betrayal, isolation, despair, and was still standing. Still trying. I was not healed yet. There were still days when the sadness returned like a heavy fog. But I no longer let it consume me. I reached for the phone. I made the appointment. I asked for help. I opened the door when my friends knocked. I began to trust again. Not blindly, not foolishly, but with the cautious hope of someone who had learned the cost of silence. I had lost so much, but I had also found something. I had found resilience. I had found clarity. And slowly, I was beginning to find myself again. I began to smile more. I started cooking again, wearing makeup, answering his calls with warmth in my voice. I laughed when he made jokes, nodded when he talked about work, and told him I loved him at the end of our conversations. I sat beside him on the couch as we watched movies, my head resting lightly on his shoulder, while my heart beat like a warning drum. None of it was real. Every gesture, every word, every moment of calm was carefully constructed. I was no longer reacting. I was calculating. Inside, I was anything but calm. My mind moved constantly, scanning for patterns, collecting details, connecting dots. I had decided to play along, to pretend that I had believed his lies, that my forgiveness had been real. But every moment I spent in his presence was a performance. I had learned the hard way that truth meant nothing to him, and so I no longer gave him the truth of my feelings. I fed him what he wanted: peace, comfort, reassurance. And behind that mask, I gathered the last pieces of what I needed. He had no idea how much I already knew. He did not know I had made copies of his messages and photographs. He did not know that I had traced his bank transactions or visited the address where his other life was unfolding. He thought I was slipping back into the rhythm of our marriage, clinging to hope, desperate to believe in him again. He underestimated me completely. At night, I would lie beside him, pretending to be asleep while he checked his phone, fingers moving quickly. I memorized the times he stepped out of the room for calls, the names he avoided saying, the excuses he repeated. I kept a small notebook hidden in my closet, tucked behind old sweaters, where I recorded every strange interaction, every suspicious moment. If he noticed my stillness, I told him I was tired. If he asked why I seemed distracted, I said I was overwhelmed with work. I used the truth as a shield to hide what he would never suspect. The hardest part was staying composed when every part of me wanted to scream. There were moments when his voice made my skin crawl, when his touch made me flinch, when his lies rang so loudly in my ears that I had to excuse myself and lock the bathroom door just to breathe. I would stare into the mirror, gripping the edge of the sink, reminding myself that this was temporary. That I was not helpless. That I was almost there. I had already started meeting with a lawyer in secret. A woman with sharp eyes and a sharper mind, who listened to everything I told her without a flicker of doubt. She helped me understand what evidence I needed to protect myself. Financial records, proof of infidelity, anything that would expose the extent of his deception. We met twice a week at a quiet cafe, far from home, where I handed over printouts and photographs, where I asked questions I never thought I would have to ask. I also began changing passwords. Quietly, carefully. I created new accounts. I backed up everything, emails, photos, recordings, and stored them on an encrypted drive only I could access. I opened a separate bank account in my name and transferred small amounts of money, enough to build a safety net without raising suspicion. I visited a therapist regularly, pretending to be going to the gym or meeting friends for lunch. I told no one what I was planning. The fewer people who knew, the safer I felt. There was one night that nearly shattered my resolve. We were at dinner, just the two of us, candles flickering between us, music playing softly in the background. He reached across the table and took my hand. He looked into my eyes and said he had never loved me more than he did in that moment. His voice was steady, convincing, even tender. For a brief second, I almost believed him. I almost fell into that old space, where his words held weight and his gaze meant safety. But then I remembered the photographs. The woman he had held in his arms at a park just 2 miles from our home. The child who looked too much like him to be a coincidence. The recordings that captured his voice whispering secrets to someone else. And I smiled. I smiled and told him I loved him too, even as my stomach turned. I knew that playing along came with risk. I knew that if he ever discovered what I was doing, there would be consequences. He had already proven what he was capable of: deception, manipulation, gaslighting. If he felt cornered, I did not know what he might do. That fear sat like a stone in my chest, but I refused to let it control me. I had spent too long in confusion and pain. This time, I had a plan. Each day felt longer than the last. The tension under the surface grew sharper. He would kiss me goodbye in the morning, and I would watch him walk out the door, wondering who he would become once he left my sight. He began to suspect nothing. He believed he had me back, fully. He talked about our future again. Children, travel, retirement plans. I nodded and smiled and waited. Sometimes, I would drive past the second house, the one he thought I still did not know about. I would sit in my car a block away, watching. I saw the lights turn on. I saw the woman arrive with groceries. I saw the child playing in the front yard. I never got out of the car. I never approached them. It was not time yet. My therapist helped me hold the weight of it all. She reminded me not to rush. She said that clarity did not always come in the moment we needed it, but that it would come. She taught me how to stay grounded when I felt the urge to collapse. I practiced breathing techniques. I started journaling again. I made space for grief without letting it consume me. There were moments, late at night, when I felt guilt pressing against my chest. I was lying to him. I was manipulating the situation. I was pretending to be someone I no longer was. But then I would remember what he had taken from me. My trust, my peace, my sense of self. I was not seeking revenge. I was reclaiming my life. The night before I was ready to move forward with everything I had built in secret, I stood alone in our bedroom and looked around. The photographs on the wall, the neatly made bed, the drawer filled with cards he had written over the years. It all looked so normal, so permanent. But I knew better now. I knew that appearances could lie, that trust could be broken in silence, that love could be used as a mask for betrayal. I was done living in shadows. I was done being fooled. The mask I wore had served its purpose. The evidence was gathered. The truth was undeniable. And the next step, the final step, was coming. I would be ready. I would not flinch. I had played along long enough. He walked in through the front door, humming to himself, carrying a small bouquet of flowers and his usual fake warmth. I stood waiting in the living room, calm on the surface, but underneath I was burning. The time had come. There would be no more pretending, no more second chances, no more waiting for the right moment. I had prepared everything, every detail, every piece of evidence, and I was not going to let the fear of his reaction silence me again. He handed me the flowers and leaned in to kiss my cheek. I took a step back. He paused, frowning slightly, confused by my distance. I asked him to sit down. I said we needed to talk. He looked uncertain, but he obeyed, settling onto the couch as I remained standing across from him. I picked up the small folder I had placed on the coffee table. My hands did not shake. My voice did not waver. I started slowly. I told him I knew. Not just suspected, not just felt, but knew everything. I said it clearly and directly, leaving no room for misunderstanding. I watched his expression change from confusion to concern, then shift into something colder, more calculating. He asked me what I meant. I placed the folder on the table in front of him and opened it. Photographs, bank statements, transcripts, printouts of messages, a flash drive with recordings, copies of emails and documents, the address of the second home, a photo of the child he never mentioned. I laid it all out piece by piece, like a puzzle completed, and watched the color drain from his face. He still tried to lie. Even then, even with everything in front of him, he reached for denial. He said it was not what it looked like, that I had misunderstood, that someone was trying to ruin him. His words came quickly, nervously, slipping into practiced excuses and frantic explanations. He reached for my hand and I pulled away. I had heard enough lies to last a lifetime. I told him to stop. I told him there was no more hiding, no more covering his tracks, no more pretending to be a man he was not. I told him I had already spoken to a lawyer, that I had already made arrangements, that this was not a conversation, it was a conclusion. He stood up then, his voice rising, anger starting to spill out from behind the calm facade he had worn for so long. He accused me of spying on him, of betraying him, of being paranoid. He said I was the reason our marriage was falling apart. He said I had become cold, distant, unreasonable. His voice thundered through the house, echoing against the walls. But I did not move. I stood firm. Every word he threw at me bounced off the truth I carried. He paced the room, breathing heavily, running his hands through his hair. For a moment, I thought he might break something, shout louder, try to scare me into silence. But then his anger began to crumble, and beneath it, something else emerged. He sat down again, covering his face with his hands. His voice dropped. He said he had made mistakes. He said he had been confused, overwhelmed, unsure of what he wanted. He said he was sorry. I listened without speaking. I had no more energy left to feed into his performance. He reached out again, asking for another chance, saying he could fix it, that we could rebuild. I stared at him, this man I had once trusted with everything, and I saw not a partner, but a stranger who had worn a mask for years. I said no. I told him the damage was done, that what he had hidden, the lies he had told, the double life he had led, could not be undone with words. I said I did not believe in the future he was suddenly trying to promise. I had believed in it once, deeply and fully, but not anymore. He became quiet then, as if the finality of it all had finally landed. He looked around the room, at the life we had built together, the photos on the walls, the memories etched into every corner. He asked me if I had told anyone. I said yes. I had told the lawyer. I had told a few people I trusted completely. His face paled further, the reality of exposure starting to take hold. There was no dramatic outburst after that, no desperate plea or sudden collapse. He sat in silence, staring at the evidence of his betrayal. I told him I needed him to leave. I said I had already packed a bag for him and arranged a place for him to stay temporarily. He nodded slowly, defeated, perhaps realizing that there was no saving what he had so carelessly destroyed. He stood and walked to the door. Just before stepping out, he turned to me and asked if I would ever forgive him. I did not answer. Some things do not deserve forgiveness. Some wounds do not heal with time or apologies. He left without another word, and I closed the door behind him. I stood there for a long moment, the silence of the house wrapping around me. My chest ached, not from sadness, but from release. The confrontation had been brutal, but necessary. I had carried the weight of his lies for too long. Now the truth was out in the open. The mask was off. The man he had pretended to be was gone. I walked back into the living room and looked at the scattered documents, evidence of everything he had hidden. I gathered them slowly, placing them back into the folder. Not out of sentiment, but because they were mine now, a record of survival, of clarity, of reclaiming my voice. That night, I sat alone in the house and felt something shift within me. I had confronted the storm, faced the darkness head-on, and I was still standing. The truth had shattered the illusion, but it had also freed me. I was no longer the woman who questioned her instincts, who doubted her worth, who clung to lies in the hope of love. I was something stronger, something clearer, and I knew, without a shadow of doubt, that I would never go back. In the days that followed his departure, the silence in the house became both a comfort and a weight. I no longer had to brace myself for lies dressed as affection, no longer had to second-guess every word spoken across the dinner table, but the emptiness echoed in the corners of each room. Every object seemed to carry a memory, and I found myself moving through the house like a ghost, touching nothing, avoiding everything that reminded me of what I had believed my life to be. Emotionally, I began to unravel. I had thought the confrontation would bring me relief, and it did in a way, but it also left behind a hollow ache that stretched across every part of me. The truth had been laid bare, but the cost of that truth had started to reveal itself. I no longer recognized the life I had lived for years. The comfort, the companionship, the security, it had all been built on lies, and now I had to tear it down piece by piece. That process, no matter how necessary, felt brutal. There were nights I could not sleep. I would sit on the edge of the bed, staring into the dark, replaying conversations from the past, trying to hear them again with this new awareness. I questioned myself endlessly. How could I have missed so many signs? How long had I lived beside a stranger? What did that say about me? These thoughts spiraled until I felt as if I were coming undone. Socially, the fallout was swift and unkind. Whispers began even before I told anyone outside my most trusted circle. The nature of betrayal has a way of spreading, as though everyone can sense the disturbance. People who once smiled warmly at us as a couple now avoided eye contact with me, unsure of what to say, afraid of saying the wrong thing. Some reached out with sympathy, offering soft words and awkward embraces, but many stayed silent. Then the truth began to reach further circles. Friends, acquaintances, people we knew through work, community, or casual dinners. I did not share everything with everyone, but it did not matter. The fragments were enough. Rumors did what they always do. They twisted facts into drama, stretched timelines, colored motives. Suddenly I was not just a wife wronged, I was part of a scandal, and everyone had an opinion. He did not fare much better. In fact, in many ways, he fared worse. The evidence I had was undeniable, and when some of it became known, particularly through legal channels, it tainted his professional reputation beyond repair. He had worked hard to cultivate an image of trust, respect, and discipline. That image cracked instantly when the first clients began asking questions. Some contracts were lost. Some relationships severed. His employer launched an internal investigation. There were legal consequences as well. I had spoken to my lawyer before confronting him, and we moved forward with separation and divorce proceedings almost immediately. But more than that, his involvement in surveillance and deceit, especially involving the hidden device in the watch, raised concerns about privacy violations. There were questions he could not answer cleanly. The possibility of him facing formal charges hung in the air, and though nothing definitive happened at first, it left a shadow over him. Financially, untangling our lives became a war of documentation and emotion. He had hidden funds, made transfers behind my back, opened accounts I had no knowledge of. My lawyer and I had to dig through layers of deception to uncover the truth. What began as a betrayal of the heart quickly became a betrayal of resources, of rights, of security. I had contributed to our life together, emotionally, physically, financially, and now I had to fight for what was mine. Each day brought a new form of exhaustion. Some days I cried over old photos. Other days I marched into meetings with lawyers and advisors with a calm determination that surprised even me. I began to keep a journal, not of feelings, but of facts. Dates, amounts, documents, contacts, details I never thought I would need to keep track of in my marriage. But now it was about survival. About rebuilding from the ashes of a life I had thought was real. I also found myself withdrawing. Not because I wanted to hide, but because the betrayal had shaken my ability to trust anyone. Every conversation felt loaded. Every well-meaning question felt like an intrusion. I did not know how to be open anymore. I guarded my heart so tightly that even simple gestures, an offer for coffee, a check-in text, felt like risks. At the same time, I began to see who truly stood by me. A few friends showed up with food, listened without judgment, sat with me through the worst of it. One even helped me clean out the house, gently packing away items that hurt too much to look at. These small acts became lifelines, reminding me that even in betrayal, I was not entirely alone. There was also a cost I had not expected, the loss of shared dreams. All the plans we had made, the future we had spoken of, the places we wanted to travel, the retirement home we had talked about building one day. They were gone. Not postponed, not delayed. Gone. Erased by the truth. And I had to mourn them as one mourns a death. The betrayal was not just an event. It was a wound that reopened every time I was asked a question I did not want to answer. Every time I saw someone who used to know us as the happy couple. Every time I had to explain why he no longer lived here. It was in the way I hesitated before trusting a smile, the way I held my breath when my phone rang unexpectedly. The consequences rippled through everything. But somewhere in the middle of the wreckage, I began to find something unexpected. A quiet strength. I had been broken, yes, but not beyond repair. Each time I stood my ground legally, each time I uncovered another hidden detail, each time I refused to accept manipulation or guilt, I grew stronger. I learned that surviving betrayal is not about forgetting or forgiving too quickly. It is about reclaiming power. It is about recognizing the true cost and deciding you are no longer willing to pay it. The consequences were real, sharp, lasting. But so was my resolve. And in that, I began to see the outline of a new future. One I would build on truth, not illusion. One that would belong to me. In the months that followed the final confrontation, I began a journey I had never anticipated, one of healing and rediscovery. The first steps were small, almost imperceptible, as though I were testing the ground beneath me, unsure of what I would find. Each day, I woke with a quiet sense of uncertainty, but also a stirring sense of something else, freedom. The freedom to be myself again, to live without the shadow of lies, to make choices without questioning my every decision. The weight of betrayal was still heavy, but slowly, I started to feel something else, hope. The house no longer felt like a prison. It was mine again, and I could move through it without the ghosts of the past trailing behind me. I found comfort in small things, cooking dinner without the constant pressure of making it perfect for someone who had never truly appreciated it, choosing the music that played in the background without considering anyone else's taste. I could leave the laundry unfolded for a few days, if I wanted to, or spend an entire afternoon reading without feeling guilty. I was learning to live for myself, and it was a strange but necessary kind of freedom. But it was not just about the physical space. I was also learning to live with my emotions, to accept them, even the painful ones. There were days when the anger flared up again, when I would remember a particular lie, or a time he had looked me in the eye and pretended everything was fine, all while carrying on his double life. The rage felt fresh every time, but I had learned not to let it consume me. I let it burn bright, and then I let it go. I would remind myself that I was no longer his victim. I was no longer trapped by his lies. It was during this period of rebuilding that I began to rediscover who I truly was. Without the weight of his presence, his expectations, and his constant manipulations, I could hear my own voice again. I began to do things I had long put off, things I had once dreamed of but never allowed myself the space to pursue. I enrolled in an art class, something I had always wanted to try but had never had the time for. I started running, feeling the strength of my body moving through the streets. I even began traveling again, taking small trips to places I had always wanted to see, experiencing the world on my own terms. The new independence I was building did not come without its challenges. There were moments when I missed the companionship, when I longed for the intimacy I had shared with him. It was hard to admit, but I had to face that I had lost not only a partner but a part of myself in the process. There were moments when I felt deeply lonely, when the silence at night seemed louder than ever. But with every passing day, I found that I could sit with that loneliness and accept it without letting it define me. I was learning to be content in my own company, to find peace in solitude. I also began to reflect on the lessons I had learned from the whole ordeal. I had learned that trust is fragile, and it should never be taken for granted. I had trusted him completely, and in the end, that trust had been shattered. But I also learned that trust is something that can be rebuilt, and not just in others but in myself. I had trusted my instincts, even when they had seemed irrational, and I had stood my ground when it mattered most. That was something I had not given myself enough credit for. I had been stronger than I had realized. I also came to understand the importance of setting boundaries. For too long, I had allowed myself to be defined by his needs and desires. I had put his happiness before my own, and in doing so, I had lost sight of who I truly was. But now I was learning to set limits, to say no when I needed to stand up for myself when others tried to take advantage. I was learning that my needs and desires mattered just as much as anyone else's. This was not selfishness, it was self-respect. Another lesson I learned was the importance of surrounding myself with people who truly supported me. In the aftermath of the betrayal, I had found that some relationships, which I thought were solid, began to fade away. People who had once been close to us drifted, unsure of how to navigate the situation, or perhaps unwilling to take sides. But others, true friends, stepped forward. They held space for my grief, gave me room to heal, and never judged me. I learned to cherish these connections, to nurture them, and to let go of relationships that no longer served me. Perhaps the most profound lesson, however, was the realization that healing is not linear. It is messy, complicated, and full of setbacks. There were days when I thought I had moved past the pain, only to find it surfacing again in unexpected ways. A song on the radio, a particular smell, a moment of quiet, anything could trigger memories, and I had to learn how to cope with them. Sometimes, I would break down in tears for no apparent reason, and other times, I would feel a wave of anger that seemed to come out of nowhere. But through it all, I learned to be patient with myself. I learned that healing takes time, and that it was okay to not have everything figured out. As I healed, I began to see the possibility of a new beginning. I had spent so many years focused on building a life with someone who had never been truthful with me, but now I could start building a life for myself. I could dream again, without restrictions, without fear of betrayal. I could create a future based on my own desires, not those of someone else. I had the power to choose my path, to follow my own dreams, and to live my life on my own terms. This new beginning was not without its challenges. I still had moments of doubt, times when the weight of the past threatened to drag me down. But I had learned to face those moments with strength and resilience. I had learned to trust myself again. I had learned to forgive myself for the mistakes I had made along the way, and I had learned to embrace the woman I was becoming. Healing was not a destination, it was a journey. And I was only just beginning. As I reflect on everything that has transpired, it is impossible to escape the symbolism of that watch, the object that began as a gift of love and quickly became the vessel of my heartbreak. The shiny metal and smooth face of the watch seemed so innocent at first. It was a gesture of affection, a way for him to show his love and appreciation. I remember how I felt the moment I opened the box, the way my heart fluttered with excitement, the way I convinced myself that this was a symbol of everything that was right in our marriage. Yet, in the end, the watch turned out to be much more than a simple anniversary gift. It became the instrument of revelation, the tool that uncovered the hidden layers of lies and deceit he had wrapped around our relationship. The discovery of the hidden compartment was the moment that everything changed. It was as though the world I had known collapsed, leaving only a heap of fragments to sift through. The truth, which had been buried under layers of manipulation and falsehoods, was suddenly laid bare. And in that moment of realization, everything I thought I knew about love and trust shattered. I had been living in a version of reality that was crafted entirely by him, and I had failed to see it for what it truly was. The lies were not just a betrayal of our marriage, but a betrayal of me, of everything I thought I was in his eyes. That moment, as devastating as it was, also marked the beginning of a deeper understanding of myself. The pain was all-consuming, but it also forced me to face the truth about my own worth. I had spent so many years defining myself by his love, by his approval, and by the image of the perfect life we had built together. When that image was ripped away, I was left to face the raw, unfiltered version of who I was, and for the first time in a long time, I had to ask myself, who am I without him? What I learned in the aftermath of that discovery was that my worth was never tied to his approval. I had placed so much emphasis on being the perfect wife, on being everything he wanted, that I had forgotten to be the person I was meant to be. I had allowed his lies to define me, to shape my perception of myself, and in doing so, I had lost sight of the woman I had been before him. The truth I uncovered did not just reveal the lies he had been telling, but it also illuminated the ways I had been lying to myself, telling myself that I was enough because I had been his. In the months that followed, I began to rebuild, not just my life but my sense of self. I reclaimed my autonomy, my independence, and my voice. The watch, in its painful revelation, had taught me the most valuable lesson of all, that my worth was never contingent on anyone else's perception of me. I had spent so long seeking validation from someone who could not even be truthful with me. Now, I was learning to validate myself. I was learning that I did not need anyone to define my worth. Love, I came to realize, is not about possession or control. It is not about living in a lie for the sake of maintaining an illusion of perfection. True love is built on trust, respect, and honesty. It is a partnership of equals, not a relationship where one person holds the power and the other is left in the dark. The watch, in its twisted role, had shown me what love should never be. It should never be a cage, nor should it ever be built on deceit. The love I had been seeking was the love I needed to offer myself first. Only then could I expect to share it with someone else in a way that was healthy and real. As for him, the man I had loved so deeply, I learned that his actions were not a reflection of me or my worth. His choices were his own, and they spoke more about him than they ever could about me. I had spent too long internalizing his mistakes, too long allowing his lies to taint my self-image. I had to learn to let go of the idea that I was somehow responsible for his actions. The moment I stopped tying my value to his deceit, I began to heal. The journey was far from easy, and it is one I continue to walk. Healing is not linear, and there are days when I still feel the sting of what was lost. But the difference now is that I no longer see myself through the lens of his betrayal. I see myself as a woman who survived, who learned, who grew, and who became stronger for it. The watch, now a distant memory, remains a symbol of the past, but it does not define my future. And so, as I move forward, I hold on to the lessons I have learned, that love requires honesty, that self-worth must come from within, and that sometimes, the most painful moments of our lives become the turning points that lead us to greater clarity and strength. There is a quiet power in letting go, in accepting that not everything is meant to last, and in embracing the freedom that comes with reclaiming your own truth. The watch, the lies, the betrayal, these are all part of my story, but they are not the story. The story is mine to tell, and it is one of resilience, growth, and the power to rise above it all.